On August 6, 1945, the United States unleashed the most devastating and controversial weapon ever seen on a battlefield: the atomic bomb. The deployment of the atomic bomb on Hiroshima and on Nagasaki 3 days later ended the most brutal and widespread fighting in history, and ultimately led to the unconditional surrender of the Japanese Empire. There's much to be said about the effects and repercussions of such a weapon on a populace. However, the question looms: what if the United States never followed through with the deployment of these weapons? Or what if these weapons led to an outcome that didn't involve the complete surrender of Japanese forces? Operation Downfall was a planned multi step invasion of the mainland islands of Japan, scheduled to begin on November 1st, 1945. Downfall was estimated to have been twice as big as D Day and would have been the biggest amphibious assault in history, with casualty rates that dwarf notable confrontations in the Pacific. It was estimated that the Allies would have suffered anywhere from 400,000 to 1 million deaths, and between 5 to 10 million deaths on the Japanese side. The invasion would involve more than 1.7 million American troops, along with thousands of ships and aircraft. With every advance the Allies made in the Pacific, the battles became more costly, not only for the Americans but for the Japanese as well. For example, the first American led campaign of the Pacific, Guadalcanal, in August 1942, saw Americans lose roughly 25% of their invading force, while the Japanese lost around 50 to 60%. Compare that to the Battle of Okinawa in the spring summer of 1945, where Americans lost a staggering 35% of their force, and the Japanese lost over 90%. If this was any indication, a campaign that took place in the heart of Japan would have been an absolute bloodbath. Given the fact that the Allies were facing a force in the Pacific that was much different than the forces they were facing off with in Europe, it was evident that downfall would drag on for a prolonged period of time. The Japanese were indoctrinated for centuries with the Bushido Code, a code that was dominated by the hierarchy of obedience and honor. There was no word in the Japanese military code for surrender. This made them very reluctant to lay down arms when the time came to fruition. On December 7th, 1941, United States naval forces were attacked in Pearl Harbor, Hawaii by the Japanese. This is the event that pulled the U.S. into the war. The U.S. retaliated the following months by conducting air raids on Tokyo with B 25 bombers. These bombings had little tactical effect, but were a tremendous morale boost for U.S. troops. American bombing campaigns continued throughout the war, but the introduction of B 29 bombers in 1944 made air raids much more precise and practical. In March of 1945, General Curtis LeMay had his B 29s reduce their altitude from 25,000 to 5,000 feet and replace their high explosive payloads with incendiary bombs. One of these raids left over 12 square miles of Tokyo burnt down and over 60,000 residents dead. Still, after these devastating attacks, the Japanese had absolutely no plans to end the war. In the spring of 1943, General George Marshall introduced a top secret strategy to invade Japan, codenamed Operation Downfall. As the war dragged on, the plan seemed more like a reality by the day. There was plenty of political infighting regarding who would command the invasion, but after many long drawn out discussions, it was announced that General George Marshall would command the land force of the invasion, while Admiral Chester Nimitz would be in charge of naval operations. Prior to any tangible attacks on Japan, the U.S. would set up a series of events that would sway the campaign in their favor. First, the U.S. would increase aid to China to draw more Japanese troops away from the mainland. Next, the British would take Burma. The U.S. would liberate the Philippines and secure the Chinese coast to establish air bases. Once the air bases were established, the U.S. would conduct massive bombing campaigns on Japan's major cities. After these events took place, the official invasion would be underway. The first phase of downfall, codenamed Olympic, was a three-pronged attack on Japan's southernmost island, Kyushu. Marines of the 5th Amphibious Corps would land on the southwest coast. The Army's 11th Corps would take Ariake Bay, and the Army's 1st Corps would land in the southeast. Olympic was scheduled for the 1st of November of 1945. It would involve over 800,000 American troops, 2,000 ships, and more than 2,500 carrier-based aircraft. The idea was to take Kyushu and use that as a staging area for the bombing of the biggest island of Honshu. Olympic would have been a much greater logistical challenge than that of Normandy. Troops would be coming from Okinawa, Iwo Jima, Pearl Harbor, the Philippines, and more. And unlike the diversionary tactics used before the invasion of Normandy, the Japanese assumed that the Allies' first step in their plan would be to invade Kyushu. There'd be no fooling the Japanese when it came to this part of the plan. The second phase of downfall, codenamed Coronet, was the invasion of Honshu, and was to take place after Kyushu was secured and more air bases were established. Honshu was even more heavily fortified than Kyushu, but the plan provided allies with a chance to use diversionary tactics and further draw Japanese forces away from the island. One elaborate tactic was to convince the Japanese that an invasion of Korea was imminent. Korean guerrillas exiled in China would cross over the border and engage in pre invasion activities. They would transmit weather reports and signal that Korean interpreters and Red Cross officials have departed from the United States. An American officer in occupied Japanese territory would then intentionally lose false documents during an inspection, detailing an invasion of Korea, and false radio transmissions would accompany this. Another diversionary tactic called for an American truck to crash, spilling documents that detailed an invasion of Shikoku. Cornet called for the U.S. 1st, 10th, and 8th Armies to invade Tokyo from the Southwest Cove and East Coast. Diversionary tactics could have aided this part of the invasion. However, it didn't change the fact that Tokyo was the most heavily fortified area in Japan. By August of 1945, Japan amassed nearly 900,000 troops on their home island. Accompanied by this would be the Japan civilian population, women and children included. Named the Volunteer Fighting Corps, nearly 28 million unarmed Japanese civilians were considered combat capable and were ready to defend their homeland by any means necessary. In order to get their civilians ready, the Japanese government printed out pamphlets. The pamphlets were called the People's Handbook of Resistance Combat. These pamphlets provided instruction on how to fight the American invading force with unorthodox tactics, such as using pitchforks, fire axes, improvised explosives, and hand-to-hand combat. Kamikazes played an important role in the defense of the Japanese home islands, and would have played a vital role in their defense if the invasion ever took place. Suicide submarines, torpedo boats, scuba divers, as well as a reserve unit of more than 5,000 kamikaze pilots were on standby in 1945. Knowing the American casualties would have been astronomical, U.S. President Harry S. Truman carefully weighed the risk versus reward of such an invasion. General MacArthur knew this, and along with an estimated casualty rate, he gave Truman an American to Japanese casualty ratio, which was 1 to 4. Truman decided a Japanese surrender was absolutely necessary and decided to pursue with downfall. Declassified documents revealed in June of 1945 that American war planners considered a proposal from the American Chemical Warfare Service to use major gas attacks prior to the invasion of Kyushu. The U.S. had over 244,000 tons of chemical weapons. Since Japan used chemical weapons in China, it was assumed the U.S. could justify the use of gas attacks in Japan as retaliation, and it's presumed that the gas attacks alone would have claimed more than 5 million Japanese lives. In July of 1945, the Potsdam Conference was the time in which Truman learned about the successful tests of the nuclear bomb in New Mexico. The Potsdam Proclamation was sent to Japan 2 days later, which detailed the conditions of a surrender to avoid the detonation of a nuclear weapon in their country. Japan dismissed the proclamation and declared they would fight till the war was won. At this time, Japan was negotiating peace with China in order to free up millions of troops to defend their homeland. But after denying this surrender proposal from the United States, the first ever atomic weapon was dropped on Hiroshima on August 6, 1945. The nuclear bomb wasn't seen as a war-ending weapon, but more as a leg up in the American arsenal for tactical use with devastating effects. Following the nuclear attack by the United States, 131 B-29 bombers firebombed Tokyo. The Japanese region of Hokkaido was pounded by U.S. naval ships in pre-invasion maneuvers. Regardless, Japan didn't surrender. Japan started peace negotiations with the Soviets. The Soviets, following through with their promise to enter the Pacific War within 3 months of Germany's surrender, declared war on the Empire of Japan and invaded Manchuria on the early morning of August 9, 1945. The same day, an American B 29 bomber dropped the second nuclear bomb on Nagasaki. The use of the nuclear bomb on Nagasaki set in motion the unconditional surrender of Japan. And on August 15th, 1945, Japanese Emperor Hirohito announced through a radio broadcast the surrender of his forces. The term defeat and surrender were never technically used. However, he made it clear that the war was over and for his country to lay down arms. This broadcast brought an end to the fighting in the Second World War. And on September 2nd, 1945, Hirohito signed the Allied conditions of surrender aboard the USS Missouri. If the proposed Allied invasion of Japan were to take place, it would have led to unnecessary bloodshed and claimed the lives of millions. Not only the lives of the young men fighting in the Second World War, but the lives of the innocent caught in the crosshairs. As controversial as the nuclear bomb was to those involved in its development, and to us looking back at its use, it's debatable that it could have been for the better. Downfall would have produced combat and devastation on an unimaginable level. It would have changed the course of history forever.